The rain fell relentlessly that evening, washing away the footprints on the muddy trail behind a young man who trudged through the storm. His clothes clung to him, soaked and heavy, just like his spirit. His name was Arjun Mehta, once a rising star in the world of professional cycling, now a forgotten name, a man crushed under the weight of a single failure that changed everything. 2 years ago, Arjun was celebrated as India's great hope in the Asian Cycling Championship. He was swift, disciplined, and unstoppable, until the crash. A split second of overconfidence, a slippery turn, and his career, as well as his dream, shattered along with his collarbone and pride. Since then, his life had been a series of unfinished attempts to walk again, to ride again, to believe again. But every time he looked at his reflection, he saw not the athlete he once was, but a man haunted by the echo of cheers that turned into silence. Tonight, he had returned to his old training trail, the one he used to ride every morning before dawn. He hadn't been there in over a year, but something inside him compelled him to face it again. The rain didn't matter. He needed to feel the place that had once given him strength. Maybe, deep down, he hoped the wind would whisper back the courage he had lost. As he stopped at the edge of the hill, the same hill he had once conquered effortlessly, he closed his eyes. He could almost hear his coach's voice, "Pain is temporary, but surrender is forever." Those words had once fired him up, but now they stung. He had surrendered long ago, not to pain, but to fear. He sat on a rock and pulled out his old cycling gloves from his jacket pocket, torn, faded, and still carrying traces of dust from that last race. He held them tight. Why did it have to end like that? He whispered to the storm. But the storm didn't answer, it only roared louder, as if daring him to rise again. The next morning, Arjun returned to the small town he now called home. He worked at a bicycle repair shop, ironic, he thought, fixing bikes when he couldn't fix his own broken dreams. The owner, Ramesh, was a kind old man who never asked questions. He knew Arjun's story, everyone in the town did. But he treated him with quiet respect, not for what he had achieved once, but for showing up every day and working with dignity. That afternoon, a group of children gathered outside the shop, giggling and cheering as they tried to balance on their old bicycles. One of them, a thin boy named Karan, waved at Arjun. "Sir, can you teach me how to ride without falling?" he asked eagerly. Arjun smiled faintly and nodded. As Karan wobbled on the bike, falling and getting up again, Arjun watched him closely. "Don't look down," he said softly. "Look where you want to go, not where you're afraid to fall." The boy tried again, this time with confidence. The bike steadied, rolled forward, and didn't fall. "I did it!" Karan shouted, his laughter echoing in the street. Arjun stood there, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. It was so simple: fall, get up, and try again. How had he forgotten that? He had taught it to himself years ago, and now a child had reminded him. That night, he couldn't sleep. The memory of Karan's joy kept flashing in his mind. For the first time in years, he took out his old racing helmet and cleaned it. He ran his fingers along the scratches and dents, scars of a life lived at full speed. Maybe, he thought, this wasn't the end. Maybe the fall wasn't meant to break him, but to teach him something he couldn't learn while winning. The next morning, Arjun made a decision. He would ride again. It wasn't about winning medals or making headlines. It was about reclaiming the part of himself he had abandoned. He didn't tell anyone, he just wheeled his repaired bicycle out before dawn and started toward the old hill trail. The first few minutes were brutal. His legs ached, his lungs burned, and his balance wavered. Every bump on the road sent a reminder of the injury that had once destroyed his confidence. But he kept pedaling. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and alive. As he climbed the hill, the same one where he had fallen years ago, he whispered to himself, "Not this time." Halfway up, his legs trembled, and he stopped, gasping for breath. His body screamed to quit. But then, from somewhere deep within, came a whisper, not of his coach, not of the crowd, but of himself. Rise beyond the fall. He closed his eyes, tightened his grip on the handlebars, and pushed again. Inch by inch, breath by breath, he reached the top. The view stretched before him, valleys, rivers, and the vast horizon. He let out a shaky laugh, tears mixing with sweat. It wasn't victory in the eyes of the world, but it was victory over his own fear. And that, he realized, was greater than any medal. Days turned into weeks. Every morning, Arjun rode the trail, rain or shine. Slowly, the people in town began to notice. Children cheered for him as he passed by. Ramesh often left a bottle of water waiting on his workbench. He still fixed bicycles during the day, but each ride became a message, to himself, to anyone who had ever fallen, that rising was always possible. One afternoon, as he worked at the shop, a man in a tracksuit entered. He looked familiar, sharp eyes, athletic build. Arjun Mehta, he asked. Arjun nodded, puzzled. The man smiled. I'm Vikram Singh, head coach for the Regional Cycling Academy. I've heard about you from some of the riders around here. They say you're back on the road. Arjun's heart skipped a beat. I'm just training for myself, he replied cautiously. Vikram nodded. That's how every great comeback begins. We're hosting a charity cycling marathon next month to raise funds for young athletes. No pressure, no competition, just a cause and a chance to ride among others again. I think you should join. Arjun hesitated. The thought of racing, even casually, brought back the ghosts he had just started to bury. But something in Vikram's tone, a quiet belief, made him consider it. I'll think about it, he said. That night, he sat by the window, staring at the moonlight falling on his bike. The idea scared him. What if he fell again, failed again? But then, he remembered Karen's voice, I did it. And smiled. He decided to register. The day of the marathon arrived. Hundreds of cyclists gathered at the starting line, professionals, amateurs, and enthusiasts alike. Arjun stood among them, his heart pounding. The last time he'd stood at a starting line, it had ended in disaster. But this time, there was no crowd expectation, no media pressure, just a road and a man determined to ride it. As the whistle blew, the cyclists surged forward. Arjun started slow, feeling the wind brush against his face. Every push of the pedal felt like reclaiming a fragment of his lost self. The trail wound through fields, riversides, and small villages, filled with cheering locals waving flags. He wasn't leading, but he wasn't lagging either. He was simply moving. Midway through the course, he noticed a young girl struggling with her bike chain. Without thinking, he stopped, knelt down, and fixed it for her. You'll be fine, he said with a smile. She thanked him and rode on. As he got back on his own bike, he realized how different this ride felt. It wasn't about beating others, it was about connection, endurance, and rediscovering joy. By the time he crossed the finish line, he was exhausted, but smiling. There was no trophy waiting, no medal hung around his neck. Yet, when Vikram approached him and shook his hand, he said, that was more inspiring than any win today. You've still got it, Arjun, not just the skill, but the spirit. For the first time in years, Arjun believed it. A few weeks later, Arjun found himself training young cyclists at the regional academy. Vikram had offered him a position as a mentor and coach. He accepted, realizing that perhaps his journey wasn't meant to end as an athlete, but to continue through those who would ride after him. He taught them not only technique but resilience, the art of getting up when the world expects you to stay down. One day, Karen, now proudly wearing a new cycling jersey, visited the academy. Sir, I joined the junior team, he announced with a grin. Arjun laughed and patted his shoulder. Then keep your eyes on the road ahead, not the fear behind, he said. The boy nodded seriously, echoing the same words Arjun had once said in passing, now carried forward as a legacy. That evening, as Arjun watched the sun set over the training ground, he felt an overwhelming peace. The crash that once defined his downfall now stood as the turning point of his rebirth. Life hadn't given him back the same dream, it had given him a deeper one. He understood now that true strength wasn't in never falling, but in rising every single time you do. He rode again that night, alone, under the stars. The wind was no longer his enemy, it was his companion. As the tires rolled against the earth, he whispered to the darkness, "Thank you for breaking me, so I could rebuild stronger." The town slowly came to know him not as the cyclist who fell, but as the man who rose beyond the fall. His story spread, not through newspapers, but through people inspired by his resilience. Parents told their children about him. Young athletes whispered his name before difficult races. And whenever someone stumbled or lost hope, someone else would remind them, "Remember Arjun Mehta. He rose beyond the fall." Years later, long after his hair had grayed and the medals on his shelf had gathered dust, Arjun still rode the same hill every morning. Sometimes children rode beside him, sometimes alone, but always with that same fire in his eyes. Each climb reminded him that falling wasn't failure, staying down was. And as long as one had the courage to rise again, no fall could truly defeat them. When asked in an interview once what kept him going after all he had lost, Arjun smiled and said, "The fall was my greatest teacher. It showed me that strength isn't about how high you climb, but how you rise when the ground gives way beneath you." The journalist paused, moved, and asked, "So what do you call that moment, when you find the courage to rise again?" Arjun looked out the window, watching the evening sun paint the sky gold. "I call it life," he said quietly. Because life, in the end, is not about how many times you fall, it's about how many times you rise beyond it. And with that, he stood, took his helmet, and went out once more to ride into the horizon, chasing not victory, but freedom.